All right, guys. This is psychology, so let's talk about our feelings. So there are three main theories of emotion in AP psychology, the first of which is the James Lange theory of emotion. So the James Lange theory was developed in 1884. The second major theory is the Cannon-Bard theory of emotion, which was developed starting in 1915. And the third and most fun to say theory is the Schachter two-factor theory of emotion, developed starting in 1962. Each of us are the sole experts in the way that we personally feel. No one can know our own emotions like each of us can, but knowing how we feel doesn't necessarily mean that we understand our emotions. So, like a lot of psychology, what these three theories do is they use science to make us suddenly doubt what we think that we know so that we can better understand the familiar. So let's go through these three theories one by one, starting with the James Lange theory. So here's a picture of William James. William James is like a philosopher-psychologist combo. Emotions are a topic humans have been thinking about for probably just about as long as they've been thinking at all. So as psychology is emerging and people are thinking more and more, he decides to tackle this very old topic a bit more analytically than people had in the past. At the time, and probably still today, most people assumed that when we feel sensations in our body that accompany emotions, those feelings are a consequence of our emotions. So we might say, I feel butterflies in my stomach because I am so nervous, or I am so scared that my heart is beating out of my chest. In other words, we feel those sensations because of our emotions. Now, William James flipped this assumption on its head and said that these changes that we detect in our bodies actually precede emotions, and that our sensations from these changes are what our emotions are. Or, as he puts it, our feelings of the changes as they occur are the emotion. So, without the bodily changes, there is no emotion at all. So if you're able to have a conversation with William James and ask him a question, you could be like, hey, Willie, what's fear? And he would reply something along the lines of, fear is the speeding up of your heartbeat, the palms of your hands sweating, your muscles tensing up, and you feeling all those changes. The James Lange theory became the dominant theory of emotion in psychology for quite a long time, but a neurologist and physiologist named Walter Cannon came along and was more than happy to point out some issues with the theory. More than anything else, the Cannon-Bard theory is a critique of the James Lange theory, rather than an attempt to provide a satisfying conclusion to the mystery of emotions. Cannon systematically pointed out flaws that weaken support for the James Lange theory, and one of the most glaring problems with William James's theory was that the same body changes happen in very different emotional states, or even during specific activities. So if fear is elevated heart rate, tensed muscles, increased sweating and breathing, it became difficult to explain what the emotions of anger and nervous excitement are. Because all three of fear, anger, and nervous excitement share almost exactly the same bodily changes. Activities can also produce these same bodily changes. For example, intense dancing can make your heart beat faster, make you sweat, increase your muscle tension, and make you breathe more. But the experience of intense dancing, although it may be scary for you or for those around you, does not always make you feel scared or angry or excited. You could just be dancing. So, if physiological changes are ambiguous, what determines which emotion we experience when these same sensations occur? This is where our man Stanley Schachter comes in with his two factors. In his own half casual and half scientific words, Stanley Schachter said, "It is the cognition which determines whether the state of physiological arousal will be labeled as anger, joy, fear, or whatever." So there we have our two Schachter factors that determine our emotions. Number one, physiological change in sensation, and number two, a cognitive label, which we essentially use to give a name and interpretation to the physical sensations we experience. So for James Lang, emotions are physiological sensations. For Cannon-Bard, emotions are not physiological sensations. And for Schachter, emotions are a combination of physiological sensations and a cognitive label. So each of these theories starts with a stimulus. A stimulus is just really something that causes a reaction. So these theories go from stimulus to some kind of response. And specifically, these three theories talk about emotions as a response to a stimulus. So let's do a specific scenario here. Our stimulus here will be a bear. Seeing a bear will lead to some type of reaction from just about anyone. So a bear will lead to some type of emotional response. So all three of these theories agree that a stimulus like seeing a bear will lead to some type of emotional response. The question is just what route and what steps are necessary to get from that stimulus to the response. The James Lang theory starts with a stimulus going to an emotion, and it adds a step in between the physiological response and sensation. So the stimulus leads to the physiological response and sensation, which leads to the emotion, which is the experience of the response and sensations as they occur. So take our example with seeing a bear. Seeing a bear will lead to some type of response, likely an emotional response of fear. So the stimulus of seeing the bear leads to a physiological change, an increase in heart rate, an increase in muscle tension, an increase in respiration, perspiration, and a decrease in digestive activity. The sensation of those changes as they occur are what the James Lang theory would call the emotion fear. The Cannon-Bard theory again starts with the stimulus leading to a physiological response and sensation, and there's also an emotional component. So the stimulus will lead to the physiological response and sensation, but the emotional response is separate and independent from the physiological response and sensation, meaning it can happen at the exact same time. How would the Cannon-Bard theory explain the emotional reaction to a bear sighting? So once again, keep the words in mind, separate and independent. The stimulus of seeing the bear will lead to a physiological change and a sensation of those changes, but it will also lead to its own emotion component. This emotion component could be ambiguous. It could be, as James Lang would say, it could be fear, but it also could be something else. It could be anger, or it could even be something positive, like nervous excitement. Like the other theories, Schachter two-factor involves stimulus, physiological response, and emotion, but it adds a fourth component. It adds the cognitive label. So a stimulus will lead to a physiological response and sensation, but the emotion is determined by the thought of how the physiological sensation should be labeled. Once again, we have our terrifying realistic bear, our physiological changes, and our plausible emotion. And now we add our fourth component, the cognitive label, which largely depends on the person. So here we have a photographer. He's excited. He sees a bear. Bear, whoa, epic. He's excited, but a little bit nervous to see this bear out in the wild. So his label determines which emotion he'll experience. And for this guy, in this case, his emotion response will be nervous excitement. Here we have the full James Lang theory, where physiological response precedes emotion, and emotions are awareness of physiological changes as they occur. Here we have the Cannon-Bard theory, where physiological response and sensation are separate and independent from emotion, and emotion and those sensations may occur simultaneously. And lastly, we have the Schachter two-factor theory, where emotions are a consequence of the cognitive labeling of a physiological response and sensation. When you want to compare and contrast these theories, just follow the pretty colored lines. Thank you so much for watching my video.